We've discussed mediation as an alternative to the litigious divorce process several times on the podcast. It's a quicker, less expensive, and certainly less stressful process than the court directed process. However, mediation can still be scary for some people. Just like divorce itself, nobody gets married thinking about how they're going to end up mediating the end of it. So, how best to prepare for mediation? Lyerly Spongberg is a DCA-certified divorce coach. One of her areas of specialization is pre-mediation divorce coaching, where she helps people build the skills to manage emotions and negotiate settlements that hold up long term. Through her national practice, Step Up with Lyerly, she helps people move through divorce with clarity, calm, and confidence. Lyerly, welcome to the Great Divorce Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, it's great to have you on, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. I have a couple clients who are about to go through mediation. And I know one of them in particular is quite nervous about the process. So I'm keen to hear how you might advise a person who's a little nervous, scared about mediation. But first, I want to back up a little bit and learn a little bit about you and how you came to be a divorce coach, and then we can get into the specifics of the work you do with people going through mediation. So, what brings you to this world?
I come to this world because in my 30s, I had my own high conflict, sort of embattled divorce, which took a couple years. And actually, we tried mediation, which did not work, and ended up sort of muddling my way through a divorce with two young children and having no idea what I was doing. And later in my life, many years later, I've been actually remarried and blended a family of eight for almost 20 years. And I looked back on that and really realized what an impact not doing it right had on me and, many different ways. And once I discovered what divorce coaching was and where I was in my life, I got certified and wanted to focus on how to make things better for people in a way that wasn't there for me. So I really come to it wanting to help people through something that was pretty awful for myself.
Well, like I can certainly relate. I can certainly relate. That's what brought me to the world of divorce financial analysis was the mistakes I made going through my own divorce. And like you, my ex and I had discussed mediation, but I think we were just so uneducated about the court directed process and the alternatives that it didn't really take hold, and we got sucked into the divorce
Right.
industrial complex, which was ended up not being a pleasant
No,
experience.
I would agree with you.
So when we talk about mediation, I've worked as a financial neutral in a boardroom where there are attorneys with their clients on either side. So essentially, I've been the mediator. I've worked with husbands and wives as a neutral, helping them prepare a settlement for attorneys. So when you talk about pre-mediation coaching, I have a sense I know what you're talking about, but perhaps you could, perhaps expand on what we mean by mediation, because we've talked about on the podcast lots of different types.
About what mediation is specifically, or
The,
what,
the
or
logistics of it. I mean, are we talking about a boardroom where there's a mediator and two
I mean,
attorneys?
right now, I think there's a lot of mediation happens over Zoom. And, I think that's just sort of changed the way the world has changed. A lot of things happen differently. And there are more, that is certainly an option, which can be very helpful for someone, especially if they feel like that's very high conflict, or there's situations where they don't really want to be in the same room with someone. And that can create a buffer, which can make it a little easier.
Right.
So that's changed. Certainly the boardroom model still exists, and some people are there with attorneys and some people are there without attorneys. So pro se mediation would be you're there with a third party neutral mediator. And that's where pre-mediation work really is impactful, is that I help my clients come at it from the very beginning, maybe even before they've said that they want to get divorced. And that means that I can help them understand all the pieces of a marital settlement agreement, what it is that they need to know. We name what their biggest fears are. And I really help my clients focus on what their values are and who they want to be at the other side of it as a co parent, as an individual. So we work backwards. And that means, your role as a CDFA, if their biggest fears are financial,
Right.
who can answer those questions for them? Because education and information is the antidote to fear. So if they have all these big fears about what the process is and the decisions that need to be made, we can work together to get answers to those before they even start mediation.
No, I think that's so important to get as educated and prepared long before the process begins. But I'm curious. Certainly, I could see your role perhaps being elevated when there's not an attorney present. But I think in this day and age, I certainly don't recommend people not bring a legal professional in at some stage along the way. So let's assuming that the clients have attorneys. How do you work with the attorneys?
So typically, when my clients, I do that work sort of behind the scenes, and I'm not, my lane is I'm not, and I don't give any legal advice. That's not my lane. I'm not a therapist. I'm not an attorney. I like all my clients to at least have a consulting attorney for them if they
Yeah,
are doing pro se
yeah.
mediation, and that's someone who has helped them know what all their rights are, know the formulas and what they could think was likely outcomes for them based on their states, so that we're working with information and coming up with proposals based on facts, not reacting
Right.
to information in a room where you've never heard it before. But what does child support look like for me with the length of my marriage, number of children, et cetera? And what does spousal support look like? So when I help my clients put together these proposals, they're getting that information from you, CDFA, and from a consulting attorney, and there's a team, and they're working efficiently because we're coming up with the questions they need answered, as opposed to just going in blindly and saying, "Hi, I'm getting divorced. I don't know anything." And that's not very effective, as you know. If someone comes to you with specific questions, you can help them more effectively.
I had a conversation with a client yesterday about potentially hiring a divorce coach. And anyone who's listened to the podcast knows that I'm a big proponent of the team approach, because no one divorce professional can be a specialist in every area. I've seen attorneys who don't know the simplest tax implications of a property settlement. Many do, but some I've seen some who make some
Yeah.
clangers out there. And of course, we know as a financial specialist, my office is better off dealing with numbers, but don't handle emotional regulation very
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
And of course, that's part of your work is in the getting people prepared for this process. So when you're dealing with somebody, when you have a client and mediation is let's say a week or two away, run us through the emotions there. What are they feeling? What are their concerns? Because our this podcast has an audience, typically people later in life,
Mhm.
and we're looking at probably the largest financial transaction in their
Correct.
lives. They've typically built up quite a bit, and they're in the late 50s or 60s or even 70s in some cases. So the implications of the divorce of the property settlement are huge. But take me through how you're calming the nerves a little bit, and perhaps telling them that this doesn't mean that on Thursday your life is going to be decided one way or the other.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of layers to what you're asking, and I think the emotional work starts from the beginning when I start working with the client. And if it's an older, someone my age and their late 50s, early 60s, you know, there's a lot of identity. Someone's identity is tied up in who they are within as a couple and their family and that history.
Yes.
And that can be very scary to think of losing that, because that involves it involves your community. It can involve the relationships you have with your spouse's family. There's a scarf assessment by David Rock. It's called the scarf assessment, and there are five. Scarf stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And in divorce, those sort of identity threats come out. All of them are threatened within a divorce process. And we talk about that. We talk about what is really scary for you here. In addition to the financial piece of it, of course, and asset distribution, but who are you if you're not married? And what does that mean to you?
Right.
And how do we talk about it? How do we identify it? How do we help you build your I call it the sort of your 2.0. Who are you on the other side of this when your relationship is, become co-parents and you have an independent life? So who do you want to be? And the other piece of your question is, when you step in there into a mediation room, you can feel a lot of power and balance. You can feel like, a lot of times women that are older, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, in that generation, a lot of times men had more control over the financial situation. They just knew more. That's just how things, typically were. And that can create a lot of fear. So again, what information do you need? What's gonna alleviate that fear? Is it speaking to a CDFA and knowing, okay, how we're going to distribute, quadros and Social Security and tax implications, and what does that look like if this is my biggest asset is my home, but if I give up my home, I've lived here for 40 years. What does that mean for me as a person and my identity? So all these things are intertwined, and we talk about how they're intertwined, and then you kind of have to break it down and I sort of say, name it to tame it. If you can name what it is that you're afraid of, then you can discuss it and work on how to resolve that. Does that make sense?
Very much so, Lyerly. And it's very interesting because you see the emotions attached to particular assets as well. And this is where I could see as a CDFA how you could be very helpful, because in many cases, not wanting to stereotype, but this is certainly what I've seen in the majority of cases, is quite often the female party will become attached to the house. Mm-hmm. It may be the place where the children were raised. They may have lived there for 20 years. They've spent a lot of time decorating and beautifying the house, the garden, and they don't want to give it up. Increasingly, maybe less I'm seeing this in gray divorce, because there may be some element of downsizing, mm-hmm. but still there's an element of this prevalent. But it may not make sense from a financial perspective, right, to keep this big house and maintain it, and when the numbers don't add up. And then on the opposite side of the coin, I like to joke, you've seen The Lord of the Rings and that little fellow who climbs over the rocks saying, "My precious, my precious." Right. That tends to be a man in his retirement account or his pension.
Yes, and yes.
You've seen that, have you?
Yeah, and I think that that is typically what I see as well. And I work with men and women. So, yes.
The interesting thing about that, just as an aside, is that desire to keep that 401k or IRA ultimately may not make as much sense from a tax perspective as other assets, which don't face the tax hit upon distribution that a retirement mm-hmm. account.
Yeah, does. And I think people don't even think about the tax implications of that. That's why CDFAs are so valuable. So what you're talking about, and the way that I help clients manage that I want to stay in my house, that is called positional thinking. So I help my clients understand the difference between a position and an interest.
The difference between a position and interest, that's interesting.
Yeah. So a position is someone who says, I have to stay in my house because I've lived here for 20 years and it's my home and raised my kids, and they're attached to what that represents in their life. That's a piece of their identity. Back to that sort of, that status, certainty, really, that assessment. That becomes so important that they get attached to it, and the idea of winning that is what's driving their decisions and their thinking. When really, if we can dig down and drill down, what does that represent? What's really important about that house? Is it that you want to keep things within that house and take them somewhere else because those things make you feel at home? If it's someone who's younger, it can be, I want to be in the same school district. Is it that my friends are around me? Or I'm nearby, I'm near my adult children. If we can break it down into what the interest is, the interest would be, I really want my beautiful things around me. I want to have a garden. I want to be close to my adult children. There are different ways to solve that problem. So the position is just like, I have to keep my house because without any other real drill down. Drilling down, once you expand on the why, then you can solve the problem in different ways. Same thing with the 401k. Is it, negotiation with mediation, the parties have more control over the outcome, which is in another way why it's more
Yes.
effective. So
Yes.
I like to say to my clients, you're going to each have the same number of Legos, say color, shape, size, number. You're going to build a different tower. So if that house is really important or the personal property within the house is more important to her and a certain percentage of the 401k or whatever, you equitable doesn't have to mean exactly the same. Equitable can mean how am I going to build my stack? How am I going to build my tower that works for me and who I want to be on the other side? So I think people get stuck on it. Everything has to be equal. It has to be exactly fair. And there
Oh
really
yeah.
is, as you know, no fair in divorce. And there's no win.
Yes.
There's no winning.
Right. It's and you say there's no winning. You mentioned the idea that we're in control of the parties are in control of the process. This is important. I think that be established at the outset of every mediation. And I'm curious whether this is something that you discuss with your clients, because I know at the beginning of every mediation session for which I'm a mediator, I begin by saying that this process can be empowering for the two of you. My whole personality changes when I'm a mediator, and I become this very softer version of myself, much more empathetic and encouraging. I like to think I'm that to a certain extent in life, but when I'm in a mediation, it's like I'm talking about, this can be an empowering process for the two of you. You're not, your future is not going to be decided by a judge who knows little
Right.
about your situation. We're here to facilitate and educate. Your attorneys are here to advise you. This is a cooperative process to try and put the whole process in, this
In their
positive.
hands. Yeah, and in their hands, right? That is really important. And I think people don't realize that as difficult or scary as mediation can be, it's also it can be much scarier to have someone who doesn't know you, who
Yeah.
doesn't care about you, who might have had a really, bad morning and shows up in court and they're going to decide for you what the outcome is of your whatever the length of your marriage is, and split up your assets and tell you this and then walk away. And you have zero control over that
Yeah.
because they're going to follow the law. And in mediation, you get to create an agreement.
That's right. You get to craft your own agreement, and you're not at the mercy. And I love what you said about they may have had a bad morning, or the judge may have had a bad experience paying spousal support,
You
or
don't know. And
yeah,
don't forget, family court judges are appointed. They're not, it's not necessarily someone who has training in family law either. I mean, they're literally can just, they're okay, we need to fill this slot and you need to go there. And you don't know, you might think that winning would feel really good if you stood in front of a judge. And this is another
right.
thing, Andrew, I'm sure you see this. People can get really stuck on what I call emotional justification.
Yeah.
Say there's been something that's happened and like they want to prove so badly
They
in
won their
sometimes
day in court.
they want someone to say you're right. It's not going to
You're
happen.
not going to get that from a judge.
You're not going to get it from a judge and you're not going to get it in mediation. And at the end of the day, that's the work you have to do for yourself. How you're going to handle whatever happened and move forward. And some people get very, very stuck on wanting to prove either that they're right or that this other person is bad. And getting stuck on that really just gets you stuck. You can't move forward.
That's a good segue into my next question, because you talk about getting stuck and what one person wants.
Hmm.
I've seen mediations where one person obviously wants to move forward with their lives and is in mediation and is ready to discuss things. And the other partner, and it could be male or female, doesn't matter. The other side, they haven't accepted that the marriage is coming to an end. Maybe they shouldn't be there. I don't know. But how do you deal, and whether your client is the person who's in, I don't want to call it denial, but they're not emotionally ready for this, whereas the other partners, let's get this resolved.
Right. Yeah. And I do see that, of course, on both sides. Um, a couple things. I think one is people underestimate in divorce how powerful and meaningful it is to grieve what's happened. And grief is a non-linear process. And it shows up throughout this process in the phases of denial and anger and all the things. And again, it's naming it. What are these emotions that you're feeling? And we have to talk about them because you can't, if you shove them under there, then you're going to be reactive and not responsive. So we do have to talk about what those all are. So grief is a big part of that. And then what it is that you can and cannot control. And we cannot control if someone has made a decision that they don't want to be with us anymore and they've filed for divorce. It's out of that client's control. What can you control? So you can control a very, very limited number of things. You can control how you show up. You can control how you take care of yourself. You can control who you surround yourself with. You can control how much information you get. You can create boundaries. You can, if this person, I deal with a lot of high conflict, and that often in those situations, it is higher conflict because something's happened that is, this decision hasn't been made together. It could be unanimous, unilateral decision. So how do I differentiate between what's within my control and what's not? How do I create some boundaries if someone is like, hey, let's start mediation next week, and let's get into it, and say, I'm not ready to do that yet. So giving some power back to that person who feels like they've lost power within that situation. So that's a lot of that work is focusing on what can I influence for myself positively, and what can I control and what can I not control.
Yeah. You know, I read a very good book about mediation that I've used some of the tools in that book, and I believe the book's called "So What Do You Propose?" And what do you do to prepare your client for they may be the person with the rigid position,
Mhm.
or they may be the person on the other side of a person with a rigid position. And when I'm a mediator, and sometimes this is the mediator's job, but of course, if the parties are more educated, more prepared, the work you're doing about the process, they can be prepared for questions like, so what do you propose? What would you suggest?
Mhm.
What are some options you'd like me to consider? This whole idea of dealing with high conflict. You mentioned the high conflict personalities, and you have to be very careful dealing with people like that and the wording you use. Can
Yes,
you
you do.
talk about that a little bit, please?
So I come from my training is an ADR, which is alternative dispute resolution. So I'm
Right.
trained as an ADR divorce coach, and that means that I am looking through and I'm trained through a conflict resolution lens. I'm also try to help my clients in those situations get curious. So the back up a little bit. So first of all, I work on putting proposals together with my clients once we have financial information, once we have legal information they've gotten from the appropriate experts, and we put together tiered proposals, and those are based on hey, pie in the sky. This is what I'd really love this settlement to look like. This is what I'm okay with, and this is what I'm actually not going to go below this, because if I stood in front of a judge, I would actually get at least this. I'm not going to go below that. So we've already done that preparation work.
Right.
We also work on how to make a proposal and how to negotiate, what that process looks like, and what questions to ask. A lot of the work I do too, Andrew, is how to sit in that window of the distress tolerance window. So how do I sit there and make a proposal and say, okay, so I think we should, I'm going to I'm going to stay in the house and XYZ, and that, this is my proposal. And that other party says, go jump off a bridge. No way. That's not going to work for me. And my reaction, and I'm saying reaction, not my response, my reaction could be like, I can't do this. And this isn't going to work. And that whole mediation session can get blown up. When I work with my clients, when they hear go jump off a bridge, they can say, take a beat, very important to pause and say, help me understand why you don't think that that's a good idea.
Mm.
So the work is to get curious about what it is. And that's there, again, back to that position. That other party's position is no way, go jump off a bridge. If I can sit in that distress, discomfort that I'm feeling, and I can get really curious about that, then we can move the conversation forward. And I am getting information, and so is the mediator, about what's important to that other party.
Yeah.
And that takes nonviolent communication education tools. It takes a lot of work on how to ground yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed, and very careful language that you choose.
You raise an interesting point there about the relationship and over history. And in reading about your training and helping clients recognize what you call a coercive control dynamic, what does that mean exactly? And does that relate to the high conflict, rigid position type of thing, or is this about the
It
dominant?
can. It can. I mean, that coercive control is where someone is, there's a power imbalance, and this is not something that happens every once in a while. This is a pattern. This is a long-term pattern of being able to gaslight, manipulate someone into not trusting themselves. That's a big part of coercive control. It also can be financial coercive control. We didn't talk about what, prepping for some of these things in high conflict divorce, but making sure you have access to money so someone can't take
Yeah.
things away. So people hide things. People are dishonest about things. People are in mediation. We know we are expecting people to be forthcoming with all of their information. You can't force that in mediation, right? You can't force financial disclosure. So the coercive control thing is recognizing what the patterns are. And the patterns that you have established within your marriage, healthy or not healthy, are going to show up louder in divorce.
Yeah,
So
everything's extreme, more extreme.
much more extreme. So I also work with my clients on understanding their conflict style and what their partner's conflict style is and how that shows up in this process. So some people are avoidant. Some people are, there's sharks, there's teddy bears, there's different ways. There's the wise owl, the people that come collaboratively that want to solve a problem, or people where their fight or flight kicks in and they have this response and this pattern that they've always done. So how do we recognize what that is? How do you think that's going to show up? I also reality test situations with my client. So what if you do say this proposal and he tells you to jump off a bridge? Let's talk about it. Let's do it.
Hmm.
So if you've practiced it, it's
It's
not
like a
as,
bit of role playing.
yeah. And then, like I said before, instead of reacting, then you're responding. And
Hmm.
responding is where you have your power and your control. And the other piece of that, sort of that coercive control, high conflict partner, is if I can help my client show up differently when they've always been the one that felt they were less powerful in that relationship, the entire dynamic can change. So if all of a sudden this person's used to, triggering me by saying that thing, and all of a sudden I'm capable of sitting there and hearing it and not getting affected by it, that changes the whole dynamic right there.
It's clear to me the value that you can add for a person going through mediation who may be uncertain or nervous about the process. But what do you say to someone who may be sitting on the fence as to whether or not it's worth it or worth the cost on
Oh,
top of
coaching.
yes.
I think that people can see it as an additional cost. Uh, Coaching has not been around for that long. Thankfully, it's becoming, more and more people are finding out about it and what the value that it brings. I can help people save time, money, and stress. And that in divorce is everything. So I think people come in thinking this is going to be an additional cost and it's already so expensive. But if I can help my client, at what it costs to hire me versus what an attorney charges for an hour or a mediation session, if they can sit in a mediation session or two effectively instead of blowing it up,
Yeah,
they're already saving money. If I can
definitely.
help them go to have a consulting attorney as opposed to putting a retainer in for an attorney, but they're using an attorney on an hourly basis to get very specific information that they need to put together a proposal and to review a final agreement before it's signed, they're saving a lot of money. And
Definitely.
and I think people don't talk about the other costs of divorce, which are overwhelm, stress, lack of sleep, spinning all the time, all these worrying things. I'm also training co-parenting, so let's get that co-parenting piece of this all together. And children at all ages are impacted by divorce. So you have to measure the cost of divorce in all the ways. How you show up at work, how all the pieces of it are relevant when you're determining is it worth having a coach. That's my opinion.
On that note, if someone listening to the podcast is interested of availing themselves of your services, Lyerly, how do they find you? And you work nationally. You work with people across the country, correct?
I do. I work nationally, actually having a few clients internationally as well. You can find me at stepupwithlyerly.com. And that's where I have, my website, what it looks like to work with me and all different aspects of the different kinds of coaching I do. I'm also on Instagram at stepup_with Lyerly. And I try to, give a lot of good information out there and hopefully help people, in that way as well.
Terrific. Is there any last words, anything we didn't cover that you'd like to get across before we sign off for the day?
No, I think we did. I mean, I think the important thing is that the whole idea of divorce coaching, is specifically pre-mediation coaching, is getting clear on your goals and who you want to be on the other side of this. If you can do that in the beginning, if you can start at the end, then your path forward is actually much, much more effective and efficient. So I think that's something I'd like people to take away.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Lyerly.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Grey Divorce Podcast. To learn more or get in contact with your host, you can visit Andrew's website at transcendretirement.net. Also, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. That helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Information provided is educational only and should not be construed as legal or tax advice. Each situation is unique and should be discussed with your tax or legal advisor prior to implementation. Andrew Hatherley is not an attorney and does not provide legal advice. Information provided is financial in nature. Advisory services offered through Hatherley Capital Management, LLC. Divorce financial analysis services offered through Wiser Divorce Solutions, an affiliated company.